Hey everyone, it's Jessie from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. Even though it looks like a beautiful day outside, which it is, right now I am thinking about the 2024 season. So I wanted to take you along my planning journey and have you get into my headspace of how I am planning. Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I live in New Jersey in zone 7A. So this is new. The USDA just updated its hardiness maps. We were in zone 6B before, and now we've been bumped up to zone 7A, which is exciting in the sense that we can definitely overwinter some more stuff. We already knew this, but not so exciting in the sense that obviously the planet is warming. Anyway, I digress. So I'm going to my third year of flower farming, and I am going to be selling both retail and wholesale. So I think this video is helpful for anyone who is contemplating on selling to more than one type of outlet. So specifically here, what is the difference between planning for selling to retail versus to wholesale? And so there are a couple of factors to consider here that I'll walk you through. And two, I want to show you high level how I am crop planning and how that looks differently than what I was doing in year one. So you can see in the background, this is where I grow. I grow outside. When I started out flower farming, I knew I wanted a manageable space. So this is a 40 by 90 foot space, and I focus on what we call the shoulder seasons. So the shoulder seasons are spring and fall, but more specifically like earlier spring and later fall when you're playing with those frost dates and there's not a lot of flowers available. That's where I knew I wanted to specialize because there's not a ton of local flowers there. And then I even added winter into the mix, and I do that by hydroponically forcing tulips. So what that means is that without intending to, I somehow have had flowers since November of 2022. That is 13 months, and I will be having my first winter tulips in December. So I will be effectively having flowers until whenever I want to stop. And I definitely want to take a break this upcoming July/August. Like not for the full 2 months, but I want to take a few weeks off, and I don't want to be farming as much outside during that time of year. So I wanted to make sure that when I was crop planning that I was looking at high level from a month perspective when the stuff that I wanted to grow was coming in and whether or not that would allow me to have a break in those times of the summer where I don't want to be farming outside. So let's get down to it. Now, I want to talk high level first about the differences between selling wholesale versus retail. When I say wholesale, I mean to florists, to designers. There's a bunch of different types of florists out there. I've done a couple of videos about it. I've actually done a series about cold calling florists and doing your homework ahead of time. I will link that video above here and in the description below. But just very, very high level, you've got florists who do event work, right? They're kind of more like designers. They do weddings, showers, celebration events. Those florists are very different than a neighborhood florist that either takes in orders from like a 1-800-Flowers type of thing or Teleflora, or if they're just selling directly retail, like these big, nice designed bouquets, but they're selling one-off bouquets. So you've got designers that do both, and you've got designers that specialize. I say this because I started selling this year at what we call a cooperative. So for those of you who don't know what a floral cooperative is, it is basically where a bunch of growers get together. So there's 6 of us. We're all in New Jersey within like a 2-hour radius. We are the South Jersey Co-op. There's actually a North Jersey Co-op too, and even a Philly Co-op. So we've got 3 co-ops within a 1-hour vicinity of me, which tells you what the demand for local flowers is. We've got designers coming in from New York, from Philadelphia, from New Jersey. So us group of growers get together so that we have a big supply of flowers, and then all of these other designers come together and shop from us as a collective. So you've got the supply power together powered by multiple growers, and then you've got purchasing power through multiple designers. So the more designers you can attract to your co-op, obviously the better sales your co-op can do, and then your co-op obviously also needs to then find more growers or a way for the current growers to increase their production. So I say this because this context is really important. I am not growing just out in the field, taking a bucket and going to a florist and saying, hey, what would you like from this week's availability here? This is not necessarily on the fly selling. When I sell at a co-op, I have to be able to project in advance a full week what I confidently think I will have for the week after. So that goes towards pre-orders, but then I also have the opportunity to bring additional bunches to what we call market floor. And when the floral designers come pick up their pre-orders, they're able to shop this market floor. So all the co-ops might be structured a little bit differently. This is how ours is structured. And I would say that typically you're looking at maybe like 60% of the orders go through pre-order, and then another 40% go to market floor, and it fluctuates by season. So having given you that context, for me next year when I sell wholesale, the things that I am really looking on honing in on are one, quantity. So quantity is something that if you're considering selling wholesale, you need to have, but for me, it's almost magnified to a different level. And what I mean by that is one of the things that I heard other growers at the co-op also learn a bit of the hard way is you want to have enough quantity of the same color of the same variety. So let me give you an example. When I'm going out into the field and I'm looking at what I have this year, what happened was I said, okay, I think maybe I'll have one bunch of this, maybe I'll have 3 bunches of that, and at best maybe I'll have 5 bunches of that. I for the most part was really pre-selling up to like 2 to 3 bunches max of something, which isn't a lot. And if you don't have a ton that is growing, then you can't be as confident in terms of listing more bunches. And if you think about the types of florists who are coming to buy from us, they are predominantly designers. What are they using these stems for? They're using them for centerpieces. They're using them for potentially archwork, maybe some bridal and bridesmaid bouquets, but they're looking for at scale certain types of stems to be able to use across the board. So if you can only sell 10 stems or 1 bunch of something, that's not very useful unless if they're using that for a specific bridal bouquet. But if they're looking to put stuff into centerpieces, they need more of a certain color or variety. So therefore you actually pigeonhole yourself if you don't have enough to offer and you're the only one who is growing that. So I am being a lot more mindful about growing in quantity. Whatever I choose to grow, I want to make sure I have a lot of it. So one, I can confidently forecast, and 2, there is a higher likelihood of someone wanting to buy multiples of it. The other thing I am now really being cognizant of is just what can I grow better out in the field here? So a bit of context here. I am by far the smallest grower in the co-op. I am also doing this as a side hustle. So there are a couple of other growers who are also doing this as a side hustle, and some of them do this as a full-time gig. The ones who do it as a full-time gig have structures, they have hoop houses, they have stuff that makes their flowers grow really, really tall, beautiful quality stems. And for what they're growing, I am not going to compete against that. So a good example is foxglove. They are able to achieve really, really beautiful, tall foxglove. Now there is a place for shorter foxgloves, such as the ones that I will produce in the field, right? Not everyone wants a 3-foot tall foxglove. That is really great for like a statement type of centerpiece at a wedding, but not great for a bridal bouquet, right? So there's a place for shorter as well as taller foxglove, but foxglove is not necessarily a crop I want to compete against other growers because multiple growers are growing it and they typically can grow it better than me. But there are certain things that others are not growing that I have grown and that I am confident in growing, and those are the things that I will scale up. So I'll talk a bit more about the varieties specifically in the crops that I'm going to grow, and you'll get an idea for what I'm talking about here. The last thing that I'm asking myself is, what are certain crops that people are growing, but there is a demand within a subset of that? So meaning color or specific variety, right? So within snaps, you've got different groups and you've got different types of just how the flower head looks, right? You've got the traditional snap, you've got like the Madame Butterfly, the Chantilly. I actually noticed that there wasn't a ton of these open-faced Chantilly or Madame Butterfly snapdragons that they were selling. Now, snapdragons for me were a bit of a tricky crop this year just because of the heavy thrips pressure that we had. So I will be growing snaps, but just a traditional snaps. We're talking about Opus and Maryland. I'm experimenting with basically group 1 snaps to see if I could beat the thrips. But overall, snaps are not a big part of my plan. Multiple growers grow snaps indoors in the hoop houses, and they are fantastic. But things like zinnias. So I didn't grow zinnias this year because I got hit with powdery mildew last year so badly that it didn't feel like it was going to be a profitable crop. But this year I had a couple of volunteers, and I noticed that the ones that came up later in the summer and really bloomed during September, they held on really well. And of course, powdery mildew eventually took over. But for the most part, I got quite a bit of usable stems from there. So I say this because I noticed that at the co-op, zinnias did really well, but people were predominantly growing some of the Queen series. I didn't see a lot of lime in there, and when I had some lime, it did sell. But people were growing more of like the Dawn Creek type of color. So we're talking about like very muted tones, very pastel-y tones. And so I think things like Jazzy Zinnia, which I grew a couple of years ago, could do well there. And I think that Senorita, which is a cactus type of zinnia, could also do well. I had a couple of volunteers at that. It's a little bit bubblegum pink, but there are a couple of florists who do like that for their retail customers. So I will definitely be growing more of that next year. I started referencing color, and that is another big thing that distinguishes between selling wholesale and retail. So especially if you're selling wholesale to designers, they are not looking for that bubblegum pink, that bright saturated red or highlighter yellow, right? They're looking for those romantic pastel-y colors. White even. I feel like it kills some of us growers to be selling in mass white flowers when there's so much color around us during the height of summer. But it is what it is. A lot of brides like white, and a lot of brides want those romantic types of colors. So I, this year, or upcoming this year, really need to be mindful of putting more of those pastel-y colors in. This year, when I was, or I guess the year before when I was planning for this year, I didn't realized that I was going to be selling to this co-op, right? I hadn't applied for it. This was kind of like a last minute thing. So I had a lot more retail type of colors, and it really bit me in the butt. So a really good example is the first two markets. I was the only one who had a ton of tulips because I hydroponically forced them. The first market started on April 5th. I think one other grower may have had like a bunch or two, but I was the only one who had tulips. Everyone else basically had daffodils and other stuff that come up during that time of year. The problem was I had the wrong color tulips. I had Ad Rem, which is this gorgeous, but it is very orange. So not necessarily super versatile in design work unless if a bride is looking for that palette. And typically brides are not looking for that color palette in early spring, right? That color could do well during Easter and just mixed with other bright colors, especially at a farmer's market, but not at a market. So I didn't sell a ton of tulips to the co-op designers because I didn't have the right colors, which is kind of crazy, right? So if I had sold that to a retail market, I would have done so well. And most of my tulips were sold to retail customers. So even the tulips that I ordered this year, I made sure I had a blend of pastel versus the bright colors. And I'm going to save more of those pastels as well as the doubles, the parrots, for later on when the market opens and I can sell to the designers. All right, so let's quickly talk about how I think about the retail side before we talk about specific flowers. So for the retail side, the flowers that I grow have to also be able to sell to the florists. Now, I did talk about differences in color and that being potentially a deterrent for some of the florists. We do have a few florists who will call it are a bit bolder, and they're even willing to push their clients to add a little bit more punch and splash into their color palettes. But that being said, we're talking about really dedicating a small portion of what I grow for that type of color splash. Now, one thing that's up in the air next year is whether or not I will still do a CSA. I will definitely be selling bouquets to the local country store, which gives me a lot more flexibility, right? Because then I can just drop off bouquets whenever I have inventory or if I can't sell stuff at the co-op. But for the most part, I don't know if I want to deliberately do a CSA with all of the planning and the logistics involved, and just, I know that work is going to be a lot more crazy next year. So I want to really focus on the wholesale side. But that being said, I want to have a backup for an outlet of flowers in case if I can't sell all of them wholesale. wholesale. So in order for something to really qualify as a flower out in the field, not only does it have to be wholesale worthy for designers, but it really needs to be double hitting. And what I mean by that is it needs to accomplish two objectives in the retail setting. So one example could be it needs to be able to stand up on its own in a straight bunch or in a mixed bouquet. Good examples are Lisianthus, lilies. These you can put a few stems together and be quite profitable at selling relatively lower price bouquets, because if you grow a lizzie well, you can get like 3 to 4 bloom heads, you stick 3 to 4 stems in, you charge $15 to $20, and you can make a relatively good ROI on that. Lilies are the same. Tulips even, I find that winter tulips are very, very profitable. When it comes to spring tulips or field-grown tulips, depending on how much labor you put in and when the tulips come, if everyone gets tulips at the same time, it is hard to make that as profitable in a straight bunch, but certainly profitable in a mixed bouquet. Another combination could be that whatever I grow can double as both a focal flower, but also be used for foliage. So a good example that I discovered this year was dahlias. Dahlia foliage is actually awesome to use in a mixed bouquet. The dahlias are the foliage, the stems start rooting. So anything that roots in water is obviously going to give you a fantastic vase life. And I found that towards the end of the season, when the dahlias were eager to go to seed because it's shorter day length, they're just tired, it's like the end of their lifespan, they're eager to put on seed, which means that the bloom heads are going to be a lot more open. So even the ball varieties are not going to have that tight ball. They're going to have more of an open center. At that time, you're not necessarily looking to use the dahlias as a focal flower, but you could be using the foliage. And at that point, the flower itself is very dense, right? It's almost like a bush. So that makes for great foliage. But someone even told me that they specifically grow dahlias from seed for the foliage earlier in the season, and I think that is really genius. So I did save some seed, and I might even try that for foliage reasons. So this year I would say that what I really lacked in late summer to early fall was foliage, and even though I got away with making focal bouquets and making them profitable, I feel like that just having a few more sprigs of green really adds a pop, especially if I'm having them at a country store and I'm trying to attract customers to buy the bouquets. But I also feel like that obviously with more greens, it's bushier. You can use less focals, and therefore it makes the bouquets a lot more profitable. The last thing here is if it could be fresh or dry. Even though I don't do a lot with dry flowers, it's always good to have that flexibility. And the other thing with if a flower can be dried, I feel like that you have a longer harvest window in terms of when you could harvest that. So straw flower is a good example. Now, I know that a lot of people say you don't want to harvest a straw flower when you can see the orange and the center being very, very open. I would say that for our designer and florists, they kind of like it when it's super, super open. And at that point, it's also less prone to wilting. So there's different applications for flowers at different stages of where they're blooming, depending on the needs of the designer. But something like straw flower, if I can't harvest it in time and I wait a little bit more, I have different outlets that it can appeal to. And then the final last backup is drying it and then sending it to friends or using it for whatever else later in the season. The last thing I want to talk about before we talk about the flowers themselves. This type of thinking is really different than year one thinking, because year one I was so focused on how many flowers do I need of something. And even though that is still obviously a really big consideration this time, I would say that is almost getting into the weeds a little bit too much, because I see a lot of people who are just starting out saying, hey, like, I want to grow this, I want to grow that. Am I going to have enough to make 20 bouquets? And I would say, start a higher level. Who are you going to sell to? Most people are not going to start off selling to florists. They're going to start selling at like a market, or they're going to potentially try a CSA, or they're going to sell to neighbors and friends. So think about not just from a color perspective, but if you're going to grow something like a Lisianthus, something that requires a lot of time in the field, a lot of babying, and obviously when you buy it from plug or from seed, it is a lot higher cost than growing something like cosmos or zinnias. Are you going to be able to fetch the premium pricing that you need to make it work? Ranunculus is also another really good example. A very tricky crop, but if you are able to master it, you can fetch a good return, assuming you have the right types of customers buying. I can tell you that at my farmer's market that I sold at, yes, people appreciated Lisianthus, but really not at the point where I felt like if I just sold to retail, I would get that adequate kind of ROI. I felt that when you factor in labor, the florists, even though they're paying less per stem, they're obviously buying in bulk. That makes a better return on investment for me for Lisianthus. So I will be growing 2 trays of Lisianthus, and I will probably be selling it to both outlets, but I will still prioritize the florists over the retail, because my experience has shown that I get anywhere from like $3 to $4 a stem retail for Lisianthus, and from the florist side, I'm able to get upwards of like $2.50 to $3 a stem, right? Like, it just depends on, do you have the market that is going to appreciate what you're growing and be able to compensate you adequately for both your time and your costs associated with growing that crop. So I would say that that's like the one thing that you should definitely be thinking about. In your first year, you could be growing Lisianthus because you could want to challenge yourself as a grower and see if you can get it. But if you're trying to grow a lot of it thinking you're going to make a killing, you better make sure you have an outlet for that. And then I would say that it does make sense to say, hey, I am aiming for X amount of bouquets, and this is what I am looking for to make those bouquets. Am I going to have enough plants? Like, yes, that is definitely something that you want to think about. I think that people just get a little bit too hung up on that without thinking about how they're going to sell their bouquets. Now it's finally time to get down to the nitty-gritty, the specific flowers that I'm growing. So what I did was I spent about 20 minutes in front of Excel. I put all of the crops that I plan on growing or that are already perennializing out there in the field. And then to the right of that, I put the 12 months of the year, because my first thing that I wanted to look at was roughly what time of year everything is going to bloom. And are they going to bloom during July and August? So I already mentioned that I am growing Lisianthus. When does Lisianthus bloom? It blooms most likely in late July, early August. So that's fine, because we're talking about a couple week window where these Lisianthus are going to bloom. I'm not growing a ton. I'm not growing all of the groups. I'm only growing, I think it's like 1 group or 2 groups. So yes, I will have to be farming outside, but the goal is to not have to proactively sell every single week. So what this exercise is good is, one, it helps me see, okay, so if I'm going to have Lisianthus bloom that time, I want to make sure I have some other stuff blooming during that general time too, so that I can make the trip down to the market worth it for the co-op. Now the co-op is about an hour south of me, which really isn't a big deal until you start throwing in the fact that now I have to commute up to work, which is about an hour and a half to 2 hours away with traffic directly from the co-op. So it's like in 2 completely opposite directions, and I'm a little bit smack in the middle. So it's not very time efficient, right? So in order for that market to be worth it, I want to be selling realistically at least $500 worth of product to make it worth my time. So what does that mean? That means I want to time my cosmos to come in around that time. I want to time potentially zinnias, right? Maybe I'll be growing lilies too, and I might want to time it during that time too. So this just gives me a very good 30,000 foot view of when things are going to come. It also tells me that, hey, I'm going to have a pretty busy June and a pretty busy September. That's good, because from what we observe with our florists and designers, it is peak during spring. And then it starts going down, especially when you get to July 4th. And after July 4th, it's like you just hit this cliff and everything goes down. You start climbing out of it. And then after Labor Day, things start taking off again. I would say that by the time you get to mid to late August, things are definitely picking up. And after Labor Day in the fall, it's like gangbusters. And this makes sense because a lot of the designers who we work with can be choosy. They have pretty high minimums for their events. There are very few people who, first of all, want to do an event in the middle of July during the height of summer. And it is not the best time to showcase flowers, right? When you think about how flowers get just mishandled during events, right? Like people are taking photos or not necessarily sticking the flowers back into water afterwards. They might be prone to wilting. And then you've got earthwork outside that can't be necessarily in water. there's a lot of things to consider, and there's a lot more room for error when it gets really, really hot. So it's not to say that these designers can't do it in the summer, it's just they don't want to deal with it. So we still have sales during July. They're just a lot less than, especially we'll call it like September, October, and May and June. So just based off of this Excel exercise, I started shifting some things in terms of, one, I wasn't going to grow some stuff and I put them back in, and there was some other stuff where I was going to grow and I took them out because I just didn't like when they were going to bloom. And if you're completely new and you don't know when things are going to bloom, I encourage you to go on Instagram, look at growers that are closer to you in geography and see when things bloom for them. For me, going back into my photos, looking at what the market photos were during certain parts of the year is also really helpful for me, because I'm adding things out in the field that I've never grown before, but that I want to trial. So Scoop Scabiosa is a really good example. Scoop Scabiosa is really expensive from plugs. They come in like a 50 cell tray, and I think it's priced at like $117 maybe from Farmer Bailey's without shipping per 50 tray. So it's not cheap, but they are highly productive and they do really well with florists. And it's one of those crops that I'm willing to take a risk on and trial. So I do have a small group of flowers that I have never grown before that I will trial, but most of the flowers that I'm growing are flowers that I have grown and am relatively comfortable and confident with. So let's go high level through what my list looks like. Now I have 24 varieties here, which is more than I thought I would have, honestly. But you know, we are talking about like a 10-month, close to 12-month time span. And some of these things are, as I mentioned before, like perennializing. They're hardy down to my zone. They will give me multiple flushes for a couple of years, or they will self-reseed, right? So good examples are sea holly, yarrow, foxglove, what else? Sweet William. Those all fit into that category. Oh, and then I also put in like 70 mountain mint plants. Unfortunately, mountain mint flowers during the month of July. So I'm hoping that because I put them in random parts of where I am in landscaping, that I'll get a staggered bloom. So I obviously, like, mountain mint does relatively well at the co-op. It's a great greenery, but I am not going to go down to the market just to sell mountain mint. So then we've got other things like tulips. I'm adding daffodils this year. Lilies, of course, will be a mainstay. Those are things that I am definitely going to grow, and that those are just kind of like givens. And they bloom during times of year where there's really not much else. So what that means is with tulips, I need to go big on tulips, right? I need to have a certain quantity available for sale for each of those markets for it to be worth my time, right? So just seeing when things are blooming, when there's a gap of just not having a lot of things bloom at once, tells me I need to have more quantity to grow of that one thing to make it worth my time. Some new things that I'm adding in, or not necessarily, yeah, I guess new things, bachelor buttons. I said I would never grow bachelor's buttons before until I saw how well they did at the co-op. They obviously come at a time of year when there are a few other flowers. I think if you grow some of the other more unique colors for the florists, they actually could do well. We'll see if harvesting feels like gomphrena and if I ever grow them again, but I am trialing bachelor's buttons. I had a lot of nigella self-reseed, and what I love about nigella is that if you miss the harvest window for the flower, you can totally get the seed pod to also sell, and that does really well with florists too. I am actually adding eucalyptus this year. Eucalyptus is more for my personal just curiosity on how I can grow it and potentially overwinter it in a pot, how tall it can get out in the field. It's not necessarily going to overwinter in my field out there. We've got a couple of growers who do really, really well with growing eucalyptus in their high tunnel. So obviously I don't have a high tunnel out there, but I feel that eucalyptus does really well in retail bouquets. So especially if I'm selling at the country store, I feel like I could do straight bunches of that, or I could put that in mixed bouquets. Things that I'm bringing back, cosmos, zinnias, all really great for the wholesale side. Cress even. Cress is it was penny cress that I grew 2 years ago, and it was okay for retail, but I think for the florists, they typically really liked cress this year, so I'm going to try my hand at penny cress. And then there's other stuff on here that you can see. The one crop that I will be bringing back in higher quantity that is not necessarily for florists is sunflowers. Sunflowers was my most profitable crop in year one because I sold predominantly retail. I am really hoping that the sunflowers will give those country luxury bouquets a little bit of a boost. So this is basically my plan for 2024. It is still subject to be changed and amended, but for the most part, I wanted to make sure that if I had to order plugs, I knew high level quantity wise what I wanted to order, and even just varieties that I wanted to focus on based off of when they would bloom, so that I could have a few weeks off in July and August. Let me know in the comments below, 1, how do you crop plan? 2, what are certain crops that I should actually be thinking about given what you see with my plan that I'm potentially not thinking about? There are definitely crops that I think would fit here that I intentionally did not want to grow. So agrostemma or corn cockle is a really good example. Now I feel like that's a very polarized type of flower because it looks so like prairie and wildflower like that some people feel like customers feel like it's a wildflower, but it does really, really well with our florists. However, we have 2 growers that grow so much of it and do so well that I don't even think I need to add to that. So I'm trying to find things that are a good fit for me in terms of as an individual grower, but also add value for the co-op that I'm growing with, right? Like we don't view ourselves as competition within the co-op. We view ourselves as a team. All of us, even though we're in New Jersey, we're in different parts of New Jersey. So when we get certain crops blooming is going to look very different. It's great because it gives the buyers more staggered availability. So for example, someone got Lisianthus in like mid-July. Most of us obviously got it in early August. I got it in mid-August. So we were able to provide Lisianthus for over a full month to our designers. And so that's always what we're trying to think about, right? Like what are certain things that are so popular that we need multiple growers growing because there's such high demand for it? What are certain things that people just want to specialize in growing? And so then we can offer both volume and diversity to our customers. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful for you. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.